There are kings who rule because men love them. There are kings who rule because men fear them. And then there are kings like Draven Vexmore, who rule because every man who ever challenged that truth ended up feeding the crows outside Velmora's walls. But here's what no empire built on fear ever survives long enough to learn. The moment a single person stops being afraid of you, everything you've built starts to crack. Stay until the end of this story. You'll understand why. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, and let's begin. The Winter Ascension ceremony came every year like a wound that refused to close. It began at dusk, when the obsidian towers of Velmora Palace caught the last of the dying light and threw it back across the capital in shards, cold, fractured, the color of old blood. The city below moved like something underwater, slow and cautious, every citizen and merchant and street rat calculating precisely how visible to make themselves on a night when the Alpha King walked among them. Too visible meant attention. Attention from Draven Vexmore meant something you didn't recover from. The ceremony itself was older than the Empire, older than the Nightfang bloodline, older than the wars that had carved these territories out of wilderness and rival packland and sheer brute stubbornness. It was supposed to be a celebration, the turning of winter, the acknowledgement of dominance renewed, a king standing before his people and his court, and every lord who held land under his name, and those lords bending their necks to confirm that, yes, the hierarchy still stood. Yes, the Alpha was still apex. Yes, another year had passed without anyone being stupid enough to challenge what Draven Vexmore had spent 15 years making absolute. Nobody called it a performance of submission to his face. Nobody called it anything to his face except ceremony and tradition and honor. Draven walked the length of the throne hall the way a man walks through territory he has broken so completely it no longer interests him. 30 feet of black stone floor, 40 nobles on either side in their finery, their best silks and polished insignia, their careful expressions. Every one of them tracking his movement from the corners of their eyes, calculating his mood the way sailors calculated weather, looking for the signs that told them whether tonight was safe or whether they were about to get swallowed by something they couldn't survive. He was 34 years old and looked like something that had been assembled from war rather than born. 6'4", broad through the shoulder in a way that wasn't vanity but physics. The accumulated density of a man who had been fighting since before he was old enough to shave. His hair was black and kept short because he'd learned long ago that anything longer gave opponents something to grab in close quarters. His face carried 2 scars, one across the left jaw from a blade, one cutting through his right eyebrow from a bolt fragment that had come within an inch of taking the eye entirely. He had never bothered to be self-conscious about either. Scars meant he'd been in the kind of fights where those things happened and had walked away from all of them. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Nightfang throne, black plate worked with the wolf-head sigil of Vexmore. The iron crown seated on his head like something that had grown there rather than been placed. He wore it the way he wore his own skin, without thought, without performance. The nobles bowed as he passed. He did not look at them. He took the throne with the same energy he did everything, absolute and without ceremony of his own, settling into the obsidian seat, not like a man arriving, but like gravity reasserting itself. The hall held its collective breath for exactly 3 seconds. Then Lord Halvard, his court chancellor, began the formal recitation of the ceremony's acknowledgement portion, the long rolling list of titles and territories and pack affiliations, and Draven let it wash over him the way he let most of what happened in this room wash over him. His eyes moved, not obviously, not the way an anxious man's eyes move, darting and revealing, the way a predator's eyes move, systematic, unhurried, covering the room in segments. Threat assessment so old and ingrained it barely registered as conscious thought anymore. It was just something his mind did in the same way his lungs moved air. He cataloged faces. He cataloged the small tells. Who was standing close to whom? Who had shifted alliances since the autumn gathering? Who was wearing new insignia that hadn't been there in October? Who was maintaining careful distance from the throne line? Who was watching the doors rather than the dais? Court politics were a different kind of combat, but combat all the same. And Draven had survived long enough in this seat by treating it exactly that way. Lord Brennick Fallorn was standing 3 degrees closer to Lord Cassian Vale than he'd been at the autumn gathering. Fallhorn held the western grain territories. Vale controlled 3 passes through the Ashmark Range. Draven filed that proximity in a corner of his mind without changing his expression. High Warden Orin was sweating more than the hall's temperature justified. Orin was 62 years old and had served 2 kings before Draven. He was the kind of man who sweated when he knew something was coming that he hadn't found a way to position himself for yet. Lord Malric Dreadbane stood to the right of the dais at the post that marked his status as general of the crown's armies, and he was watching the ceremony with the composed patience of a man who had decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment. Draven had known Malric for 11 years, had fought beside him in 7 campaigns, had handed him more authority over the Empire's military structure than any general had held in 4 generations. Because Malric was genuinely gifted at war in ways that most men who called themselves soldiers never approached. He studied Malric's face for a moment longer than the others. Something was there, some quality of stillness that was not entirely comfortable. Draven had learned over the years to trust that kind of perception, the wordless alarm that his instincts threw up when something in a pattern didn't align the way it should. He had also learned to give it time before he acted on it, because instincts could be wrong, and acting on wrong instincts had political consequences. He let it sit in the back of his mind and kept moving through the room. It was during the 5th formal acknowledgement, Lord Casimir Vrain of the Eastern Reaches, a small man with excellent teeth and almost no spine, delivering his oath with the melodic fluency of someone who had rehearsed it, that Draven's attention snagged, not on a threat, on an absence where there shouldn't have been an absence. At the far end of this hall, in the section designated for minor noble bloodlines and returned court members, a woman had taken a place that had been empty for 6 years. She was not remarkable to look at. That was the first thing he noticed, and the noticing itself was strange because in a hall full of people who had dressed and arranged themselves specifically to be visible, to broadcast wealth and status and the particular kind of beauty that courts required as currency, this woman had done none of that. She wore deep gray, not morning black, not the rich jewel tones that marked ambition, but gray the color of winter stone. Her hair was dark and dressed simply. She was perhaps 26 or 27, medium height, carrying herself with a stillness that wasn't submission and wasn't performance. She was looking directly at the throne, not at the ceremony, not at the spectacle, at him. Every other pair of eyes in the hall, when they found the throne, did one of 2 things: slid away quickly or held with the specific quality of a person managing their expression very carefully. Fear dressed in decorum. He had been looking at that his entire reign and could read it the way he could read weather. This woman's gaze was neither of those things. It was... He searched for the right word and did not find one easily. It was direct, uncomplicated. The way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand rather than something they are afraid of or trying to impress. Lord Halvard had finished the recitation and was waiting. Draven pulled his attention back to the front of the hall. "Proceed," he said. His voice filled the hall the way it always did, without effort, the particular resonance of an alpha who had never needed to raise it to be heard. The ceremony continued, but something in his chest had shifted 3 degrees to the left, and he spent the rest of the formal proceedings aware of it the way you're aware of a stone in your boot, not crippling, not ignorable. After the formal portion concluded, the hall opened into the gathered court reception, the part of these evenings that Draven tolerated rather than attended in any real sense. Wine was served. Music played from the gallery. The noble houses clustered and reclustered in the endless fluid negotiation of court hierarchy, proximity to the king treated as a currency everyone was trading in. Draven descended from the dais because not descending would be noted and interpreted, and he had long since learned that absence was itself a message. He stood at the edge of the central floor, accepted wine he wouldn't drink, and let Lord Halvard bring him the people he needed to speak with, one by one. Lord Brennick Fallhorn, regarding the delayed grain shipment from the Western Territories. Draven listened for 90 seconds and told him the shipment would not be delayed further or Fallhorn's excuses would be the last thing delivered out of the West. Fallhorn went pale and bowed and removed himself. High Warden Orin, regarding the border garrison reinforcements. Draven told him the request had been reviewed and partially approved, which was not what Orin had hoped for, but was what the strategic situation actually required, and Oren took it with the practiced acceptance of a man who had learned not to push twice on the same night. General Malric Dreadbane did not approach. He stood across the hall in a knot of 3 other senior officers, talking in the low, easy tone of men discussing nothing in particular. Draven watched him for a moment from across the room, and that same quality of wrong stillness was still there, faint and unqualified, like something heard at the edge of hearing. He was deciding whether to cross to Malric or wait, when someone came to stand 2 feet to his left. He turned. It was the gray-dressed woman. Up close, she was not what the distance had suggested. There was a sharpness to her face, the kind of intelligence that didn't perform itself, didn't push forward to be recognized, just lived quietly in the quality of attention she paid to things. Her eyes were dark green under the hall's torchlight, and they were doing now what they'd been doing from across the room, looking at him like a problem she hadn't solved yet. She did not bow. She inclined her head, the correct formal gesture for a noblewoman addressing the king at a reception rather than at court, technically proper and notable for being technically proper rather than excessive. "My lord king," she said. "You're Ravarin," Draven said, not a question. He had placed the bloodline somewhere around the 4th minute of the reception, cross-referencing the position she'd been given, the gray she was wearing, the 6 years of absence. The Ravarin family had held territory in the northern reaches until her father's failed gambit in the 3rd year of Draven's reign, when old Lord Aldrich Ravarin had aligned himself with a coalition of packhouses that had thought, wrongly, disastrously, fatally wrongly, that a coordinated push in the early years might dislodge a new king before he consolidated. It hadn't worked. Aldrich Ravarin had lost his lands, his title, and his life, in that order. The remaining family had retreated from court and from public life, which was the smartest thing they could have done. Something moved across her face, not flinching, exactly, more like a person absorbing a word that had weight. "Celine Ravarin," she said. "Yes." "Your petition to return to court was reviewed in October," Draven said, "approved on the basis of conduct during the exile period and absence of any renewed affiliation with destabilizing interests." "I know." "Then you know that approval was not an invitation to approach the throne at a formal gathering." "I know that too," she said, and she still wasn't looking away, and her voice was even and unhurried. "I came anyway." The hall was close enough around them that being seen talking to her was already happening. 6 people were cataloging this moment with the focused attention of individuals who traded in exactly this kind of information. "Why?" Draven said. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the distinct impression she was deciding whether to give him the answer that would be safe or the one that was true. "Because I wanted to know if what I'd heard about you from a distance matched what I'd see up close," she said. "And I wanted you to see me before any of the people in this room had the opportunity to tell you what they think I am." Something shifted in him, not dramatically, more like a door moving on its hinges without opening. "And what do they think you are?" he said. "A liability," she said. "A symbol of a failed rebellion they'd prefer to pretend didn't touch them. A woman who came back to court because she has no other options and should therefore be managed carefully and discarded strategically." A small pause. "None of those things are accurate." "What is accurate?" "I came back because the North is being administered badly, and someone who knows that territory needs to be somewhere they can say so," she said. "And because hiding from what my father did for the rest of my life would mean he won twice." Draven studied her face. "Your father tried to kill me," he said. "He funded an alliance that put 800 soldiers in the field against the crown. He killed 63 of my men before we ended it." "I know what he did. Do you have a position on it?" Something crossed her face. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something older and more complicated. "I think he was wrong," she said. "Not because he lost, because he built his entire strategy on the belief that fear of the throne was a weakness rather than the most powerful force in these territories. And he was stupid enough to try to use that against a king who understood it better than he did." She looked at him steadily. "He deserved to lose. I've had 6 years to arrive at that conclusion, and I am comfortable with it." Draven said nothing. She continued, and her voice didn't change, didn't grow harder or softer, just stayed that same, even direct quality. "I'm not here to apologize for his blood or ask you to forget it. I'm here because I'm the only surviving Revaran, and the northern territories my family understood for 3 generations are now being managed by men who've never seen them in winter, and people are going to die from that mismanagement inside of 2 seasons if no one with real knowledge speaks up. That's why I'm here. The hall moved around them. Music and conversation and the fluid politics of court gathered and dispersed in the middle distance. Draven looked at her for a long moment. You will present your case regarding the Northern Territories in formal court, he said. Standard petition process. Lord Halvard will set the date. She nodded. No performance of gratitude, no excessive deference, just acknowledgement. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. It's a process, not a favor. The petition will be heard on its merits, not on whatever this was. Understood. She inclined her head again in that technically correct gesture. My Lord King. She moved away into the gathering. Draven watched her cross the floor for exactly 4 seconds, which was approximately 3 seconds longer than he watched most people do anything. Behind him, Lord Halvard appeared at his shoulder with the quiet manifestation of a man who had been managing the king's schedule and proximity for 8 years. That was the Revaran woman, Halvard said, not a question. I know who she is. Shall I keep her petition at the bottom of the... Put it in the next standard session, Draven said. 3rd or 4th item. Give it appropriate time. Halvard's pause lasted approximately half a second, which from Halvard was an entire soliloquy. Of course, my lord. Draven moved away into the hall and did not look back at her again that night. He thought about what she'd said, walking in a way that didn't show he was thinking, nodding at the correct faces, exchanging 3 words with Lord Vile about the Ashmark passes in a tone that told Vale he was being watched without making it explicit. His mind sat with the Revaran woman's words, the way it sat with any intelligence that arrived unexpectedly from a surprising source, turning it, examining the angles, looking for what it told him about the person who had delivered it. He couldn't find a strategy in it. That was the strange part. He was a man who had spent 15 years reading strategy in everything. Every gift offered, every alliance proposed, every word spoken in his presence, and he could not locate the play. She told him her father was wrong to rebel. She told him she had real knowledge the Northern Territories needed. She'd been direct in a way that nobody, in 8 years of sitting on this throne, had been direct with him, not without either fear underneath it or ambition on top of it. Either she was the most sophisticated political actor he had encountered in a decade of ruling men who treated politics like blood sport, or she was exactly what she appeared to be. He didn't know which possibility unsettled him more. The winter reception wound on. He endured it the way he endured all necessary things. Present, watchful, saying what needed to be said, and nothing beyond it. Lord Malric caught his eye once from across the room and raised his cup in a small toast, the easy gesture of a trusted general at a formal occasion, and Draven returned the gesture and thought about that quality of wrong stillness and said nothing. By the time the hall began to empty, the obsidian towers outside were catching moonlight instead of the dying sun, and the empire of Nightfang was continuing in its ordinary way, brutal, efficient, held together by 14 years of dominance applied without hesitation or mercy to anything that challenged it. Draven walked the private corridors back to his chambers with 2 guards at the standard distance behind him. The palace at night was a different animal from the palace in ceremony, quieter, harder-edged, the stone walls stripped of the performance that daylight and gathered nobles imposed on them. He had always found it easier to think in these hours, less noise between him and whatever needed thinking about. He stopped at the window of the east corridor, which overlooked the capital's lower city, the packed buildings and narrow streets and lights that stayed on through the night in the market districts. 300,000 people living under the shadow of Velmore Palace, paying taxes to the crown, obeying the laws his wardens enforced, going about their lives inside the structure his dominance had imposed. Nobody had asked them if they wanted to live under fear. He knew that. He had known it for years in the particular way that practical men know things, not as a source of agony, but as a fact about the world that needed to be understood rather than resolved. You governed with what you had. What he had was power, and power at this scale only held through the credible and consistent willingness to use it. His father had taught him that. The bodies of the men who had tried to take the throne during the first 3 years of his reign had confirmed it. He stood at the window for a long time. He kept thinking about the word she'd used. Stupid enough. Describing her own father. Said flatly, without performance of emotion, as a strategic assessment. He couldn't find the falseness in it. People lied to him constantly. It was one of the defining experiences of holding power, the way every voice around you shaped itself to tell you what it calculated you wanted to hear, and he had developed, out of sheer necessity, a sense for the weight of genuine statement against the hollow sound of managed truth. Her voice had had weight. He stayed at the window until the capital's lower city went quieter, and then he moved on to his chambers and did not sleep easily, which was unusual enough to be worth noting, except that he had no one to note it to, and it said nothing, he was prepared to admit. 3 days after the winter ascension ceremony, Celine Reverin appeared in formal court for her petition hearing. She had dressed differently, not elaborately, not with the studied display of someone trying to make an impression, but in dark blue that was clean and deliberate, her hair arranged in a practical style. She stood at the petitioner's post at the center of the hall without fidgeting or adjusting her expression for the assembled nobles and advisors who watched from the sides with the collective attention of people who had already decided this was entertainment. Draven sat the throne. He had 4 other items to get through before her petition, and he moved through them at the pace they deserved. 2 administrative matters, 1 territorial boundary dispute that had been running for 2 years and was going to require a more substantive hearing, 1 request for additional garrison funding from the southern commanders that he approved at half the requested amount with conditions attached. Standard court. Necessary work. When Lord Halvard called the Revarin petition, the quality of attention in the hall shifted in a way that was invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Draven paid close attention to everything. Celine walked to the petitioner's post without hurry. The petition concerns Northern Territorial Management, Lord Halvard announced. Specifically the Greyvast and Iron Hollow regions currently under administrative assignment to the Eastern Warden Council. I've read the petition, Draven said. Celine glanced at him, a brief acknowledging look. Speak, he said. She spoke for 7 minutes. No hesitation, no performance of humility, no elaborate framing. She laid out the specific failures of the current management system with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time organizing her understanding of the problem. The crop rotation decisions that had not accounted for northern soil chemistry, the trade route adjustments that had eliminated 2 passes the eastern administrators had deemed redundant, without understanding that those passes were the only viable winter routes, the livestock management rules that had been drafted by men who had never managed livestock above the frost line. She cited numbers, she cited weather patterns. She cited a death toll, small but specific, 12 people in the Iron Hollow district during the last winter who had died from supply failures that adequate management would have prevented. When she finished, she waited. The hall was quiet in a particular way. Lord Halvard looked at the throne. Draven looked at Celine. Your proposed resolution. An advisory appointment, she said. Not a territorial holding. I'm not petitioning for land, I'm petitioning for access. To correspond with the Eastern Warden Council regarding northern management decisions, to be consulted on matters that require specific northern knowledge, to report directly to this court on outcomes. An advisory appointment requires demonstrated qualification, said Lord Karras, one of the court's senior administrative voices from the side of the hall. His tone had the careful quality of a man who had already decided on his position and was articulating it for the record. The Revarin bloodline's qualification in northern matters is not in question, but the bloodline's history of her qualifications are documented, Draven said. Karras stopped talking. Her history is documented too, Draven continued, his tone neither hard nor conciliatory, just flat and final. Both were reviewed before the petition was granted a hearing. This court doesn't hold a daughter responsible for a father's choices at the level of administrative disqualification. It holds her responsible for her own. He looked at Celine. Your petition is conditionally approved, a 12-month advisory appointment to the Eastern Warden Council, northern regions only, reports to High Warden Oren quarterly. Your access is limited to correspondence and consultation, no direct authority, no unilateral decisions. Celine said, Understood. If the arrangement produces the improvements you've described, the appointment will be reviewed at the end of the term. A beat. If it doesn't, this conversation was a waste of the court's time. It won't be, she said. The flat certainty of it went through the hall like a hand through smoke. Not loud, not dramatic. Just there, and impossible to pretend hadn't been said. Draven held her gaze for a moment. "Next item," he said to Halvard. Celine stepped back from the petitioner's post and moved to take a place in the hall's side gallery, where approved petitioners customarily stood to witness the remainder of proceedings. Draven did not watch her do it. He turned his attention to the next matter Lord Halvard brought forward. But his instincts, those wordless and particular instruments that had kept him alive through 15 years of people trying to end him, were running hot and steady, and had been since the moment she spoke her last 3 words, and they were telling him something that he could not yet translate into language precise enough to act on. They were telling him to pay attention, not to a threat, not to an asset, to something else, something his years on the throne had no particular category for. 2 weeks after the petition hearing, the first reports of irregular movement in the territories south of the Ashmark passes arrived at Velmora. They came from 3 separate sources: a border garrison commander, a merchant who had been stopped twice on a route he'd traveled unimpeded for 6 years, and a trail warden who had spotted unfamiliar pack insignia on men who claimed to be traveling traders but moved like soldiers. The reports were not alarming individually. Together they formed a pattern that Draven recognized the shape of without being able yet to see the whole picture. He summoned Malric to his private war room on a gray Thursday morning when the winter air off the peaks had settled hard over Velmora, and the palace felt like a held breath. Malric came without delay. He always did. It was one of the things Draven had valued about him, the absence of the political performance that made other commanders waste time in the antechamber while they decided how to enter. He was a broad man, gone silver at the temples, with a campaigner's economy of movement and the particular quality of alertness that distinguished men who had been in genuine combat from men who had merely trained for it. He looked at the reports Draven spread across the table. "I've seen the garrison report," Malric said. "The others are new." "All 3 arrived in the last 4 days," Draven said. "What's your read?" Malric studied the map. His finger moved over the Ashmark pass markers, the trade route lines, the garrison placement indicators. "Could be simple smuggling. The South Pass has been a trade in unlicensed goods for years. Soldiers don't move like traders." "No," Malric agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and Draven watched his face with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. That quality was there again. Not wrong stillness now, more like precision. The specific focus of a man who was thinking carefully about exactly what he was revealing. "I'll send a scout company into the Ashmark approaches," Malric said. "We'll have clear intelligence within 10 days. "Make it 7, Draven said. 7 is tight." "7, Draven said again, and the second delivery of the word had an edge in it that ended the negotiation. Malric met his eyes. 7, he confirmed. "I'll dispatch tonight." He gathered the reports with the easy authority of a man accustomed to handling sensitive material and looked at Draven in a way that was professionally neutral and had been professionally neutral for 11 years and still landed with that inexplicable quality of weight. "Anything else?" he said. "Not tonight," Draven said. Malric left. Draven stood at the war room table alone for a long time after, his hands flat on the surface, looking at the map of his empire the way a man looks at something he built with his own blood and is trying to see clearly, not with pride, not with fear, but with the hard, specific attention that dangerous situations demand. His eyes moved to the northern regions, the Greyvass district, the Iron Hollow territory, the advisory appointment he'd granted 3 weeks ago that was already, according to High Warden Oren's preliminary note, generating its first correspondence with the Eastern Warden Council. He thought about what Celine Raverin had said the night of the ceremony. The moment a single person stops being afraid of you, everything starts to crack. He hadn't said that to her. He'd thought it, standing at the window above the Capitol at midnight, and the thought had had a particular quality to it, not like a warning, but like something true enough to sit with rather than discard. He hadn't been able to decide if the cracking was the Empire or something else. The war room was cold and gray and smelled of candle smoke and old parchment, and the Empire of Nightfang stretched across the map before him in all its ugly, necessary complexity. And somewhere in the southern passes, his general scouts were going to find something that his instincts had already decided was worse than irregular trader traffic. He was right about that. The scout report came back on the 6th day, not the 7th, and it didn't come back through standard channels. It came in the form of a single rider arriving at Velmora's outer gates at 3 in the morning with a sealed dispatch that bypassed the general's desk entirely and came directly to Draven by the rider's own choice. A choice that the rider, a young scout captain named Aldrin, who had served 2 tours in the Eastern campaigns, had made because something in what he had seen had told him, with animal certainty, that taking the normal route was not safe. Draven read the dispatch by the light of a single candle in his private quarters. He read it twice. Then he sat with it in the dark for a long time, with the cold pressing in through the stone walls and the Empire quiet around him, and the particular quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the moment before everything that has been building beneath the surface finally breaks through. The movement in the Ashmark passes wasn't traders. It wasn't smugglers. It wasn't a minor incursion from a border pack testing the crown's edges the way they did every 3 or 4 years. It was 3,000 soldiers bearing the insignia of 4 different noble houses, moving in coordinated columns, supplied for an extended campaign, positioned, according to Scout Captain Aldrin's careful notation, at every choke point between the southern territories and the road to Velmora. And at the bottom of the report, in Aldrin's blocky campaign handwriting, a single additional notation that the captain had clearly agonized over, including the insignia of the commanding officer's personal guard, seen clearly at the forward position. The wolf and chain, the personal sigil of Lord Malric Dreadbane. Draven set the dispatch down on the stone floor beside his chair. He did not move for a long time. Outside, Velmora slept. The Empire slept. 30,000 citizens and 10,000 palace staff and the entire architecture of dominance and loyalty and fear that he had spent 15 years constructing, all of it resting on the assumption that the men he had trusted with the weight of it were what they appeared to be. In the dark, Draven Vexmore understood something that he would have sworn 8 hours ago was not possible. That the one man in the Empire he had trusted without calculation had just driven a blade through the foundation of everything, and 3,000 soldiers were already moving. And by morning, whether he acted or waited, the world he had built was going to be a different shape. He reached for the candle. He had until dawn to decide who else in Velmora Palace already knew. The candle burned low while Draven sat with the dispatch in the dark, and the palace breathed around him the way it always did. Indifferent, stone cold, built to outlast every man who had ever tried to rule from its center. He read the report a 3rd time. Not because the words had changed, because he needed the specifics to stop being a shock and start being a problem, and the only way he knew to do that was to force himself through the details until they were tactical rather than personal. 3,000 soldiers, 4 house insignia, forward positioning at every southern choke point, and Malric's wolf and chain at the head of it. He set the paper down. 11 years. He had given Malric 11 years of accumulated trust, the kind that gets built through shared campaigns and shared blood and the particular intimacy of men who have stood in the same fire together and come out the other side. He had given Malric more authority than any other man in the Empire because Malric had earned the authority and because Draven had believed, had calculated, which was supposed to be more reliable than belief, that Malric's loyalty was not the performed kind, not the kind that evaporated the moment circumstances shifted. He had been wrong. The understanding of that moved through him clean and cold, without the heat of betrayal, without the complicated texture of grief. There would be time for whatever that was later. Right now, there was a problem with dimensions, and dimensions could be worked with. He stood up. The first question was not what Malric was doing. That was clear enough. The first question was who in Velmora Palace already knew, and who among those people had decided that staying quiet about it was survivable. Dawn was still 3 hours away. He dressed without calling his attendants. Armor was too loud, too much signal for moving through the private corridors at this hour. He put on plain dark wool and the short blade he wore against his body in the rare hours when he wasn't in plate, the one that had no sigil on it and no history anyone knew. And he went out through the internal passage that connected his chambers to the palace's eastern wing. The guards at the passage entrance came to attention. "Stand easy," he said quietly, which in the middle of the night in the private wing meant what it always meant. The king was moving, do not acknowledge it, do not log it. He moved. He needed to find High Warden Orin first. Not because he trusted Orin exactly, But because Oren was the kind of survivor who managed to stay alive through every political shift by being useful to whoever held power, which meant his instincts about which way the wind was blowing were excellent, and his instincts right now would tell Draven exactly how bad this was. Oren's quarters were in the administrative wing. The corridor outside was empty at this hour. Draven knocked twice, waited, knocked once more, the old signal from the early years of his reign when he and Oren had developed a private shorthand for communications that needed to happen outside of official channels. He heard movement on the other side of the door. A pause. Oren deciding in the dark what the knock meant and what answering it committed him to. Then the latch. Oren opened the door. He was in his sleeping clothes, gray-haired and rumpled, and when he saw Draven, his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: relief, recalibration, fear, and settled on something that tried to be neutral and mostly failed. "My Lord King," he said. Draven stepped inside without being invited. Oren's quarters were what he expected: practical, organized, the accumulated paperwork of a man who had been managing administrative complexity for 30 years. 2 candles burning on the desk, which meant Oren hadn't been asleep. "You were awake," Draven said. Oren stopped. Something in the quality of Draven's stillness had apparently communicated that there was no version of tonight that dishonesty survived. "I received word this evening," he said carefully, "from a contact in the Southern Garrison system." "What kind of word?" Oren looked at him. The exhaustion of a man who had been calculating all night what to do with something too dangerous to hold was sitting on his face like weight. "Troop movement," he said, "coordinated. I was trying to determine the source before you brought it to me." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" Oren's hands were clasped in front of him, a gesture that was probably meant to look composed and read as a man holding himself together. "Because the insignia that was reported to me," he said, measuring each word, "was Dreadbane's. The silence between them had mass. And you needed to know," Draven said, "whether telling me was going to put you on the right side of what was coming or the wrong one." Oren's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. "That's honest," Draven said. "I'll give you that." He walked to Oren's desk, picked up the report that was sitting half-covered under a stack of correspondence. Oren hadn't even hidden it, which meant either he'd been in the middle of reading it when Draven knocked or the hiding felt pointless, and looked at it. It matched what Aldrin had sent. Different source, same picture. "How long have you known that Malric was building toward this?" The pause before Oren answered told Draven the answer before Oren gave it. 8 months, Oren said. "I had indicators, not evidence, not the kind that—" 8 months, Draven said again. "My Lord King, what I had wasn't actionable. You don't bring something like that to the throne without knowing which way it was going to fall," Draven said. "Yes, I understand your calculation, Oren. I understand it completely." He set the report back on the desk. His voice was flat and steady, and the steadiness of it was not calm. It was something harder than calm, the particular quality of a man who is not allowing himself to feel what this is, because feeling it right now would cost him hours he doesn't have. "Now here's my calculation. You have information about a military rebellion being staged against the crown. You have had indicators for 8 months. You chose strategic silence over duty. Those are the facts." He turned and looked at Oren directly. "I'm not going to execute you for it." Oren let out a breath. "I'm going to use you," Draven said. "You're going to help me determine which members of this court had the same indicators you had and made the same choice. And then you're going to help me determine which members of this court are actively coordinating with Malric rather than just watching to see who wins." He crossed toward the door. "Get dressed. You have 20 minutes. Tell no one you've spoken to me tonight." "My lord." Draven stopped but didn't turn. "The 4-house insignia in the ashmark passes," Oren said. His voice had gone quieter, not with weakness, but with the specific gravity of a man delivering something he knows will land hard. "One of them is Fallhorn." Draven stood at the door. Western Grain Territories, the man who'd been standing 3 degrees too close to Vale at the ceremony. The delayed shipment. The things you notice and file away because they're not alarming individually. "I know," Draven said. He didn't. But knowing and not knowing was less important right now than Orin not understanding the full edges of what Draven didn't have yet. He went back to his chambers through the East Passage and spent the next 90 minutes pulling the shape of it together with the reports spread across his war room table and his memory for political patterns doing the work that he had no advisors awake to help him with. The four houses, the Ashmark positioning, the timing, the winter ascension ceremony as cover for final coordination, the moment when every major noble house had legitimate reason to be present in Velmora, when communication between them would look like the ordinary machinery of court rather than conspiracy. Malric had been patient. That was the part that sat worst. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal was something Draven had modeled as a permanent feature of the political landscape from his second year on the throne. The patience was worse. 11 years of built trust used as cover for 8 months of active construction, maybe longer in the planning phase. 11 years of standing in the same fire and coming out the same side. And somewhere in those years, Malric had made a calculation and started building toward this, and Draven had not seen it. He pressed that thought flat. Recrimination was a luxury for men who had time to sit with their failures. He had until Malric's scouts confirmed that Aldrin's dispatch had reached the palace, and then he had however long it took Malric to decide that waiting was no longer the better play. Days, probably. Maybe less. It was not enough time to build a military response from scratch. It was enough time to cut the head off the coordination before it could move. At 5 in the morning, when the palace was beginning its earliest stirring, kitchen, stables, the outer guard change, Draven sent a single message through channels that he used for exactly this kind of situation, the ones that had no official existence and left no record in the administrative system. The message went to a man named Corvath, who officially held a minor role in the palace supply department and unofficially had spent 7 years as Draven's most reliable source of information about things happening inside the palace that weren't supposed to be happening. The message said 3 words: full assessment, tonight. Then he attended the morning briefing like nothing had happened, sat through Lord Halvard's schedule review with the same expression he brought to every morning, approved 2 administrative decisions that could not wait, and told Halvard that he needed the afternoon schedule cleared for what he described as a private strategic review. Halvard accepted this without apparent concern. Halvard had learned over 8 years that private strategic reviews were the kind of thing you did not ask about. Malric arrived at the morning briefing. He sat at the general's position at the War Council table with the ease of a man completely comfortable with his position and his purpose. And he presented an update on the scout deployment in the Ashmark passes that was measured and professionally framed and contained absolutely no information that was accurate, which Draven absorbed with the particular discipline of a man who has had to watch people lie to his face for years and can no longer afford the reaction of discovering it. The scouts should have preliminary reports within the week, Malric said. Standard travel time for the approach routes we sent them through. Good, Draven said. He looked at Malric across the table. Malric looked back at him with 11 years of practiced ease. Neither of them changed expression. The briefing ended. The table cleared. Draven spent the afternoon alone with what Corvath brought him, which was worse than he'd hoped and better than his worst expectation. 3 senior palace officials had active communication channels with Malric's coordination network. 2 of them were administrative positions, serious but manageable. The third was captain of the inner guard, which was not manageable in the same way because the inner guard was the layer of security that stood between assassination and the throne. He sat with that information for a long time. Then he changed the inner guard rotation using the emergency command authority that bypassed the captain's desk, reassigned 3 of the specific members that Corvath had flagged, and replaced them with men from the outer battalions who had no connection to the palace's internal political networks. He did it in the span of 4 hours through official channels that the inner guard captain would see, and he waited to see how fast the captain moved on seeing it. The captain requested an urgent audience before evening. Draven granted it for the following morning. That gap, the night between the request and the meeting, was information. A loyal man sees an unexpected rotation change and asks about it because protocol matters. A man who is coordinating with a rebellion sees an unexpected rotation change and asks about it because he needs to know if he's been burned and how fast to move. The speed of the request, the urgency of it, told Draven which one he was dealing with. He had the captain detained quietly before midnight. At 10 that evening, he was in the small war room off his private chambers when someone knocked at the outer door, not the passage, the formal corridor entrance, with a pattern that was not any pattern he recognized. His hand went to the blade at his side. "Enter," he said. The door opened, and it was Celine Ravarin, and for a moment the simple unexpectedness of her presence in this particular room at this particular hour reset every calculation he was running and left him looking at her with something that was purely human and unmanaged. She was in riding clothes, her hair down, and she had the specific look of a person who has been moving fast and made a decision while moving that they are not entirely certain about. "How did you get past the guard rotation?" he said. "I told them I had urgent information for the king that couldn't pass through any official channel," she said. "I used your name." "That could have gotten you arrested." "I know." She came 2 steps into the room and stopped, looking at the papers spread across his table with an assessment that was quick and genuine and landed on certain things with a recognition that told him she had the context to understand what she was seeing. "I had a communication this afternoon from my contact in the Eastern Warden Council," she said, "about the Ashmark passes." He waited. "There are 3,000 soldiers moving south of the passes," she said. "My contact is a man who's been managing supply routes in that region for 12 years. He said the insignia on the forward position." She stopped. She was looking at him and reading something in his stillness. "You already know." "Since last night," he said. She took that in. Her face did something complex. Not the performance of emotion, but the actual thing, the kind you can't fully control, which was relief underneath and something harder around the edges of it. "Then you understand that whoever is coordinating the movement had to have had palace access for months," she said. "The positioning is too precise, too well timed to the ceremony gathering." "Yes." "And the 4-house insignia means this isn't a border pack testing the edges. This is a coup," he said. "Yes." The words sat between them. She looked at him steadily, and he looked at her, and the war room held its cold silence around them. He was aware, in the part of his mind that never fully stopped running the security assessment of any room he was in, that she had walked into a private room in the middle of a palace security crisis, carrying information about the exact crisis in question, and that the most suspicious interpretation of that was possible, and that his instincts had not reached for the suspicious interpretation, and that he needed to think about why. "Why did you come directly to me?" he said. "You've been in this palace for 3 weeks. You have no established trust with any senior advisor. You walked past the guard rotation using my name, which was either extremely brave or extremely stupid, depending on how this goes. Because every official channel I could identify had the potential to route through someone I couldn't verify," she said. "And because I've been watching this court for 3 weeks, and the pattern of who's been careful around whom tells a story that I don't think the people being careful realize they've been telling." She paused. "I didn't know if you'd already seen it. I knew I had to find out." He watched her face. "Fallhorn," he said. "Yes." "Vale." "Yes. And 2 others I'm less certain of." She moved to the side of the table, not behind it, keeping herself clearly in view, the gesture of a person who understood the optics of the situation and was managing them consciously. "I can show you what I've observed. If it overlaps with what you already have, you lose nothing. If it adds something you don't have, then I came here for a reason." Draven looked at her for a long time. He thought about what it meant that she had done this, not brought it to Halvard, not waited to see how things settled, not made the calculation that Oren had made and sat on it until the winning side became clear. She had gathered what she had and walked it directly to the only place in this palace that was unambiguously the right place to bring it, at the cost of personal risk that was not small. Either she was the finest political actor he had encountered in his entire reign, or she was exactly what she appeared to be, and he was tired of sitting with that unresolved, and in the cold clarity of a night, when everything he'd built was showing its cracks, there was a version of judgment that was less about calculation and more about the thing he'd spent 15 years treating as a liability. He trusted his instincts about her. He pulled a chair to the table and looked at her and said, "Show me." She sat down across from him and began to talk, and the information she laid out overlapped with what he had in 3 places and extended it in 2. And one of the 2 extensions was a name he did not have yet, a name that, when she said it, connected 3 things he'd been holding as separate that were not separate, and the shape of the whole conspiracy clicked into a clarity that he felt in his chest like something locking shut. "How did you get that name?" he said. "He spoke to me at the ceremony," she said. "He thought I was a safe conversation because of my family history. He thought I would be looking for allies against the crown." Her voice was flat and even. "He misread me." The fire had burned low in the room. Outside, Velmora was deep in its nighttime quiet, the empire sleeping around a palace where the ground was already cracking under the weight of what was coming. Draven sat back. He was aware of the exhaustion sitting behind his eyes. 2 nights without real sleep, the particular cost of running a threat assessment on this scale without the option of sharing the weight of it. He was aware, too, of the woman across the table who had walked into a dangerous room with dangerous information and was now sitting in the middle of a conspiracy that could get her killed 6 different ways if the wrong person learned she'd brought it here. "You understand that being in this room tonight, with me, knowing what you know, puts you in a position that has no neutral exit," he said. "I understood that when I knocked," she said. "And you knocked anyway." She looked at him with that direct quality, the one that had no performance in it. Someone had to. He stood up. The decision had been forming for hours. In the back of his mind were things that couldn't be admitted yet went to take shape, and now it was fully formed and he looked at it without flinching. He needed someone inside the court who moved freely, who had no established allegiance that the conspiracy's network would already be tracking, who had the intelligence and the specific knowledge of Northern House politics to read the room in ways that his own compromised inner circle could not. He needed someone who had already demonstrated, twice now, that their judgment about what to do with difficult information was better than the judgment of people who had been in this court for decades. He needed someone who wasn't afraid of him. "You'll stay in the palace under increased security," he said. "Your movements will be restricted to areas I designate. You'll have access to 1 member of the court at a time through social contact that will look routine, morning gatherings, the library, whatever is normal for your position. You will report anything you observe through a channel I'll establish tonight." She held his gaze. "I'm not your instrument." "No," he said. "You're my advisor, with everything that means, including the right to tell me when I'm wrong." He paused. "And you will be in danger. I won't pretend otherwise." A long moment. "All right," she said. He walked to the door of the war room. His hand was on the latch when she said his name, not his title. His name, just Draven, flat and direct. And he stopped. "He's going to move before you're ready," she said. "Malric, whatever you've planned, he's going to accelerate the timeline because you changed the inner guard rotation tonight. And he already knows." Draven stood at the door, the inner guard captain. Detained before midnight, but detained wasn't silent. And the network Malric had built into this palace had eyes he hadn't finished mapping yet. He turned and looked at her. "How do you know about the rotation?" he said. She held his gaze without flinching. "Because the guard at your outer corridor when I came through was someone I saw speaking privately with Lord Fallhorn 4 days ago. And he was new to that post tonight. Someone moved him there in the last few hours." The cold came off the stone walls and the fire had burned down to coals. And Draven Vexmore stood in the ruin of his certainties and understood that the move he'd thought was surgical had already been read, that Malric was already recalibrating, and that whatever gap he had thought he had left was closing in the dark while they stood here. He crossed back to the table. He put both hands flat on it and looked at the papers and the map and the shape of what was coming, and he made the only decision left that had any chance of being the right one. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before court convenes, I move first." And from somewhere in the palace's eastern wing, carried on the winter air through stone and glass and 15 years of empire, came the sound of boots. Too many, moving too fast, in the direction of the throne hall. The boots kept coming, not the rhythm of a guard change. Too many men, too much urgency in the cadence. The particular sound of soldiers who had been given a destination and a reason and were not slowing down for anything between them and it. Draven crossed to the war room's secondary door in 4 strides, the one that opened into the passage rather than the corridor. He pulled it open 2 inches and listened. The sound was coming from the east wing, moving toward the throne hall, not toward the private quarters, which meant either they were taking position rather than hunting, or the hunting was going to start at the throne hall and work inward. He closed the door. Celine was already on her feet, standing at the edge of the table with the map between them, and she was watching him with the focused stillness of a person who had decided not to panic and was holding to that decision by force of will. "How many?" she said quietly. "Enough to take the hall." He moved to the cabinet on the west wall and pulled his short sword from where it sat under a campaign cloak, checked the blade by feel in the low light. "The rotation I changed tonight, 2 of the men I replaced are still inside the palace somewhere." "So the hall isn't clean?" "The hall isn't clean," he confirmed. She picked up the riding cloak she'd come in with and pulled it on without being told. She understood, without him spelling it, that they were not staying in this room. He took a single look at the papers on the table, the reports, the names, the shape of the whole conspiracy laid out in ink, and left them. No time. Whoever came through that door would find it regardless, and knowing that he knew changed nothing about what Malric had already set in motion. He went to the passage door. "Stay close," he said. "Don't speak unless I ask you something." She nodded. He opened the door and they went into the dark. The passage system beneath Velmora's private wing was not on any architectural record that Draven had ever permitted to exist outside his own memory. It had been one of the first things he'd done after taking the throne, mapping every existing passage, sealing the ones that were known to too many people, opening 2 new ones that only he could account for. It was the kind of preparation that looked like paranoia until it was the only reason you were still alive. He moved fast through the dark, Celine's footsteps close behind him and quieter than he expected. She kept up without touching him, without stumbling, navigating the pitch-black passage by following the sound of his movement with a spatial instincts that surprised him enough that he noted it and kept moving. The passage led out into the lower palace, near the administrative storage level. He listened at the exit door for 10 seconds before opening it. Empty corridor, faint torchlight, the smell of old stone and lamp oil. He pulled her through and sealed the door behind them. "Where are we going?" she said. "Korvath," he said. It took 12 minutes to reach Korvath's actual location, which was not the supply department office on the palace's 3rd level, but a set of 3 rooms in the lower administrative block that existed under a maintenance designation and had never been formally connected to any human occupancy in the palace records. Draven knocked in a sequence. A pause. Then a second knock from the other side. The confirmation that the room wasn't compromised. He went in. Korvath was a thin man in his late 40s with the unremarkable face of someone who had cultivated unremarkableness the way other men cultivated reputation. He looked at Celine once and then looked at Draven. "It's moving tonight," Draven said. "I know," Korvath said. "I heard the East Wing deployment 20 minutes ago. 40 men, maybe more. Inner Guard insignia on half of them." He paused. "The throne hall is occupied." "By whose authority?" Korvath's expression had the specific quality of information being delivered that the recipient is not going to like. Dreadbane issued an emergency security order at 9 this evening, signed under the General's Standing Authority for Internal Threat Response. He set a paper on the table. He declared a credible assassination threat against the Crown. The security lockdown is officially a protective measure. The precision of it sat in Draven's chest like cold water. Not a coup announced, not a direct seizure, a legal instrument. Malric had used the Crown's own emergency security architecture to occupy the palace under the cover of protecting it, and in the hours between the order being issued and anyone with authority to countermand it being awake and positioned to do so, the fait accompli would be complete. Draven had built that emergency authority himself, for exactly the kind of threat Malric was pretending to respond to. "The outer guard battalions," Draven said. "Commanders Reth and Fallow are loyal," Korvath said. "I'm less certain of Garrard, but Reth and Fallow command 800 between them." "Can you reach them before morning?" "Reth, yes. Fallow will take longer." "Reach Reth." Draven looked at the paper on the table. His name was on it, the king's name, cited as the authority under which the emergency order operated, which meant Malric had forged either the signature or the authorization sequence, and which also meant that the paper trail would look, to anyone reviewing it quickly in a crisis, like the king himself had sanctioned the lockdown. "I need the East Gate, 2 hours." Korvath nodded and moved. Celine was looking at the paper on the table. Her face had the expression of someone doing rapid calculations that were not going well. "He used your own instrument against you," she said. "Yes." "Then publicly countermanding it is going to look like the king rescinding his own security order, like the king is the source of the instability." That's the design, Draven said. Confusion first. The nobles wake up to a palace in security lockdown. The story from Malric's end is that the king has become erratic, dangerous, incapable, and the general moved to protect the empire from its own ruler. She was quiet. Then, how many people in this palace right now would believe that story? He looked at her. I'm not asking to wound you, she said. I'm asking because the number matters. He thought about it honestly, with the particular discipline of a man assessing a situation he could not afford to lie to himself about. The nobles who had been in this court for the full length of his reign, the years of governance through fear, the executions, the campaigns that had broken rival pacts without mercy, the particular reputation that 15 years of absolute dominance built. The story Malric was selling was not coming from nowhere. It was being built on a foundation that Draven himself had constructed. Enough, he said. Then you can't fight this the way you would fight a straightforward military challenge, she said. If you take the East Gate back by force, you look exactly like what Malric is saying you are. I know. You need the noble houses to choose, she said. Not be told. Choose. The room was small and cold, and Corvath's equipment lined the walls in organized utility. Outside, somewhere in the palace above them, 40 soldiers wearing inner guard insignia were holding a throne hall under a false emergency order, and in the Ashmark passes 3,000 men waited for the signal that the capital had fallen. Draven turned the shape of it in his mind. He had spent 15 years building an empire on the principle that force was the only argument that couldn't be argued with. Every decision he had made from the throne had come from that center. Strike hard, strike first. Leave no ambiguity about the cost of opposition. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a specific and considered philosophy about the nature of power, and it had worked, and the empire that surrounded him was the evidence of it working. And he was standing in a basement room at midnight because the man he had trusted most had used his own philosophy against him better than he had used it himself. He had not built loyalty. He had built compliance. And compliance, he now understood with the specific clarity of a man who has waited too long to understand something, was not the same thing. Compliance looked like loyalty until the moment someone offered the compliant a better calculation, more safety, more power, more survival. And the compliance evaporated like it had never been there because it had never been there. Not really. Not the kind you can build anything permanent on. He had known that. In the abstract. He had known that and proceeded anyway because he had believed the fear was sufficient. Celine was watching him. She was not pressing him. She was giving him the space to arrive at whatever he was arriving at, and the patience of it was its own form of statement. Lord Brennick Fallhorn is in the conspiracy, he said. Yes. Lord Vile is uncertain. He provided the pass access, but I don't think he's committed to the outcome. I think that's right, she said. Vale is a man who bets on winners, not on causes. He gave Malric what Malric asked for, but he'll turn the moment he sees which way this falls. High Lord Casimir of the Eastern Reaches, Draven said. He owes 3 generations of his house's land grants to the Vexmoor crown, and he hated every minute of owing it. He's been waiting for a context where he could stop owing. He's one of the 4 insignia in the passes, Celine said. Then he's committed. Draven moved to the room's single table and looked at the map Corvath kept there. A working map, annotated in a dozen different hands, the living document of the palace's internal political geography. His finger found the residential wing where the remaining uninvolved noble houses kept their court apartments. There are 7 House representatives here tonight who aren't in Malric's network. 3 of them I can make a case to. One of them commands enough landed loyalty in the Central Territories to shift the calculus if he's visible in the right place at the right moment. Celine came to stand beside him at the map, close enough that he was aware of her warmth in the cold room. She looked at the positions he was indicating and said, Lord Severin Aldrath. You know him. I've spoken with him twice since I returned to court. He's cautious. He doesn't commit to anything he hasn't thought through 3 times. A pause. He asked me, during our second conversation, what I thought of the king. Draven looked at her. I told him I thought you were more complicated than your reputation, she said, and that I thought your reputation was going to become a liability before the year was out, if nothing changed. She met his gaze. He didn't disagree. Something moved in his chest that wasn't anger and wasn't quite anything else he had a clean name for. When did you form that opinion? Watching you at the petition hearing, she said, when you told Karis that this court doesn't hold a daughter responsible for her father's choices. A beat. A man who governed purely by fear and dominance doesn't say that. It was inconsistent with your reputation. I've been thinking about the inconsistency ever since. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. Then he looked back at the map. I need to reach Aldrath before Malric does, he said. If Aldrath wakes up to the palace in security lockdown, and the first voice in his ear is Malric's, the case becomes much harder. I can reach him, she said. You don't have... I have social access, you don't, she said, with the flat practical tone of a person stating an operational fact. A woman walking the residential corridors in the middle of the night raises different questions than the king, and Aldrath has met me. He has a baseline for my judgment. She looked at him. You know I'm right. He did know she was right. That was the specific frustration of it, that the correct tactical decision was to send her into the palace's occupied corridors alone. And the other thing, the thing he was not naming, was pushing back against the correct tactical decision with an irrational force that he had no experience managing. If you encounter Malric's men, I'll tell them I was woken by the noise and came to find out what was happening, she said. That's true. It will hold for as long as I need it to. He studied her face, the steadiness of it, the quality of a person who had looked at a dangerous thing and decided, not out of recklessness but out of something more considered, that it was worth doing anyway. Go, he said. She went. He stood in Corvath's room for 3 seconds after the door closed behind her, and he did not move. And then he moved, because standing still was not an option he had ever really had. He reached Commander Reth through Corvath's channel 40 minutes later. Reth was a compact man from the northern campaigns who had the specific loyalty of a soldier who'd watched his king fight in the same mud he fought in, which was the kind of loyalty that didn't run the numbers the way Orin ran numbers. He listened to Draven's summary with the focused quiet of a man absorbing orders. And when Draven finished, Reth said, You have 400 men at the East Gate in 90 minutes. And that was the whole conversation. Draven was moving back through the lower passage toward the palace's western residential access when he heard it. A sound from a cross passage, low voices, the particular cadence of men trying to be quiet and not quite achieving it. He stopped in the dark, pressed himself against the stone, let his breathing go shallow. 2 men, moving toward him from the passage that connected to the outer guard rotation. He could not see them, but he could hear the specific quality of their movement, purposeful, searching, not routine. They passed the junction without turning. He waited 10 more seconds, then continued. The western residential corridor was quiet. He reached the access point that opened near the Noble House apartments and went through, and the corridor beyond was empty except for 2 of Malric's inner guard soldiers standing at the far end near the main staircase. They turned when they heard him. He walked toward them with the direct, unhurried movement of a man who owned every corridor he walked, because that was all he had right now. That and the short sword under his cloak, and the calculation of which one to take first if the bluff failed. My Lord King, the senior of the 2 said. His hand was not on his weapon, but it was near it, and his face had the quality of a man who had been given instructions that were now in conflict with the thing standing in front of him. Stand down, Draven said. The 2 words carried everything he knew how to put in a voice. The absolute expectation of compliance, the implied cost of its absence, 15 years of being the apex of this structure, and meaning it. You're in my house. The senior guard's hand dropped from his weapon. The second one looked at the first. A moment stretched. Then both of them stepped aside. He walked through. He found Celine outside Aldrath's apartment in the upper residential wing, and the look on her face when she saw him told him something had happened before the words did. Malric has Aldrath, she said. He's in the throne hall. The cold of it landed before the understanding. Since when? An hour ago, according to his attendant. They came for him personally, 4 soldiers. She looked at him with the expression of a person delivering information that changes everything. He's not the only one. Halvard is in there too, and 3 other senior advisors. Not the throne hall as an occupied position. The throne hall as a holding facility. Malric had pulled the court's senior figures in under the cover of the security lockdown, putting them in a room where his version of events was the only version being spoken. He's not taking the throne by force, Draven said slowly, working it out as he spoke. He's going to take it by consensus. He's going to hold them in that hall until enough of them agree that the king is unfit, and then he's going to have a document. And then it's not a coup, Celine said. It's a succession. The thing that happened in his chest at that moment was not fear. Fear was something he had burned out of himself through years of deliberate exposure to the things that caused it, because an alpha who could be touched by fear was an alpha who could be predicted and maneuvered by anyone patient enough to use that lever. What happened instead was something colder and more fundamental. The understanding that he had been outplayed, that the 11 years of trust he had extended had been used to build a trap specifically shaped around his nature, and that the trap was now closed. He could take the East Gate with Reth's 400. He could fight through the throne hall and pull Malric out of it and put his head on the wall, the same place he'd put every other challenger in 15 years. But Aldreth would be in there when it happened, and Halvard, and 3 other men whose credibility in the noble houses was the only thing that could confirm his legitimacy in the aftermath. If they died in the recovery, if this became a bloodbath, which it would, because Malric had not done all of this without preparing for the armed response, then whatever Draven won would be a throne standing in ash over the bodies of the men who legitimized it. He stood in the corridor at the top of the residential wing, and he understood, with a completeness that he had never allowed himself to experience before, that the version of him that had built this empire was precisely the version of him that could not save it. The throne hall doors were 20 feet away. Through them he could hear faintly the murmur of forced assembly, voices, movement, the particular acoustic quality of a large stone room containing too many unhappy people. And then the doors opened. Malric stepped out. He was fully dressed in his general's formal uniform, and he looked at Draven with the composed, unhurried expression of a man who has stopped performing and is no longer interested in the maintenance of appearances. Beside him were 4 soldiers who had the specific stance of men who had been told the king was coming and had prepared accordingly. "Draven," Malric said, "not my lord king, not your majesty." 11 years of titles stripped off in one syllable. "You planned this for how long?" Draven said. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Something moved across Malric's face. Not regret, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has made a large and irreversible decision and is facing the full cost of it in the presence of the person it most cost. 14 months, he said, since the Iron Vast campaign, since I watched you order the burning of a settlement because 3 men in it had harbored a border raider. A pause. There were 212 people in that settlement, Draven. I know how many people were in it, and you still gave the order. The raid killed 40 soldiers and sent a message to every border territory that the crown could be touched without consequence. He kept his voice level. I made a calculation. That's all it was, Malric said. A calculation. Every life in this empire, a calculation. Every alliance, a calculation. Every man who served you, numbers in a column. Something hardened in his expression. You can't build a kingdom on that. You can build a prison. You built a very effective prison, but the moment someone finds the key, it all opens at once. And you found the key. You handed it to me, Malric said, 14 months ago, when I watched your face while you gave that order and realized you felt nothing. The corridor held its silence. Celine was behind Draven and to his left, and he was aware of her the way he was aware of everything in a confined space, the weight and position of things that mattered to his survival, except that the awareness had a different quality than it did with other things, and he had stopped pretending it didn't. I'll give you terms, Malric said. Because we were what we were, I'll give you terms. Speak them. The crown passes to a regent council pending selection of a successor from the remaining Vexmore bloodline. A pause. You leave Velmora before morning. You take nothing official, no title, no authority. You live. He looked at Draven steadily. And the Ravaran woman is brought before the assembled nobles in the throne hall tomorrow and charged with conspiring against the security of the empire. She confirms your erratic conduct. She gives the council the document they need. The sound of it was almost abstract. Almost. Draven heard Celine's breath change behind him. Not dramatically, not a gasp, just the small involuntary shift of a person's body when something lands in the place that hurts most. He did not look at her. He looked at Malric. And in the space where his response should have been forming, the calculation, the tactical assessment, the weighing of survival odds and strategic value, Something entirely different was happening, something that had no precedent in the way he made decisions, something that was neither calculation nor fear, but felt, in its own particular way, like clarity. "No," he said. Malric studied him. "You understand what you're refusing." "I understand exactly what I'm refusing." "Then you understand that I will take the throne hall, and the noble houses, and the document, and the army, and the Ashmark passes, and this palace, and you will have nothing." "Maybe," Draven said. He looked at Malric and the 4 soldiers and the occupied throne hall behind them, and he was still, the way stone is still, and something in the quality of that stillness reached back to the oldest instinct he had, the one that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with what he was willing to let go of and what he was not. "But I won't have that," he said, "and right now that's the only thing I'm certain of." Malric looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past him, at Celine. "You chose a strange time to discover sentimentality," he said. "It's not sentimentality," Draven said. He reached back without looking and found Celine's wrist, not her hand, a grip, firm and certain, the grip of a man who has made a decision with his whole body rather than just his mind. "It's the first choice I've made in 15 years that I'm certain is right," he said. And then Commander Reth's signal, a single horn blast from the east gate, clean and hard in the winter dark, broke the silence of Velmora Palace wide open. The horn blast hit the palace like a stone through glass. Malric moved first, not toward Draven, but back toward the throne hall doors, a commander's reflex, the instinct to secure the position before engaging the threat. He got 2 steps before Draven was on him, not with the sword. With his body, the full weight of a man built by 15 years of warfare hitting Malric at the shoulder and driving him into the corridor wall hard enough to crack plaster. Malric was not small, and he was not slow. But Draven had the angle and the rage, and rage in a contained space is its own force multiplier. They hit the wall together, and the 2 nearest soldiers lunged, and Draven took an elbow across the jaw that split the inside of his cheek and tasted like copper and didn't matter, because what mattered was the 3 seconds he needed. He got Malric's collar, got his face close. "Call your men off the east gate," he said. "Now!" Malric's teeth were showing. "It's already done, Draven. Reth's signal doesn't change." The throne hall doors burst open from the inside. Not Malric's soldiers. The wrong direction, the wrong sound. The sudden surge of noise that meant something had happened inside the hall that nobody had planned for. One of the soldiers near the door turned to look, and that was the fraction Draven needed. He drove his knee into Malric's thigh, shoved him sideways, cleared 2 feet of space, and had the short sword in his hand before the soldier who'd turned came back around. "Stand down!" His voice cracked through the corridor like a whip, and 2 of the 4 soldiers flinched, not stepped back, flinched, which was the involuntary response of a body that had been conditioned for years to respond to that voice with obedience, and which conditioning didn't evaporate overnight, no matter who had issued new orders. Those 2 seconds were all Reth's advance men needed. They came through the residential stairwell door at the far end. 8 soldiers in outer battalion colors moving fast and clean, the specific economy of men who had been briefed and were executing, and the calculus of the corridor changed completely. Malric straightened against the wall. His face had gone flat, the emotion stripped out and replaced with the cold assessment of a general reading a battlefield. He looked at Draven. He looked at the 8 men. He looked at the odds. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Draven said, "it isn't." Malric turned and walked back into the throne hall, and Draven let him go. Because stopping him here, in a corridor, with hostages behind those doors and 3,000 soldiers in the Ashmark passes still waiting on a signal, was not stopping him. It was just delaying the version of this that happened with more bodies in it. He turned. Celine was against the wall where she'd pressed when the fight started, and she was watching him with the alert stillness of someone who had held herself completely still through something that could have gone several different ways and was only now letting herself breathe. There was no performance of relief on her face, just the honest recalibration of a person coming back from a held breath. "You're bleeding," she said. He touched his jaw. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing, but it can wait." She looked at the throne hall doors. He went back in, with Aldrath, Halvard, all of them. "He's going to move fast now," Draven said. "He knows Reth is at the gate. He knows the corridor play is gone. He looked at the 8 soldiers Reth had sent, who were holding positions with the disciplined quiet of men waiting for instruction. He needs the document before I can challenge it publicly. He needs the noble houses in that room to sign something in the next hour, or the window closes. Then we need to open those doors before the hour's up, Celine said. Opening those doors with soldiers is what he wants. He gets to say the king forced the court at sword point. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, what if the court came out on its own? He looked at her. Aldrath spoke to me, she said. He's in there because Malric's soldiers brought him, not because he chose to be. He's not a man who tolerates being managed. She met Draven's eyes. If there's a way to get a message to him, just Aldrath, not the others, just the one, telling him what's actually happening outside those doors, he's the kind of man who makes a decision and makes it loudly. He doesn't need saving, he needs information. Draven stood in the corridor with blood on his jaw and the palace shifting around him like ground before a collapse, and he thought about what she was describing. It was not a military play. It was a court play, the kind that required understanding how individual men made decisions, what they valued, what kind of pressure they responded to, and what kind they dug in against. It was her kind of play. Can you get a message in? He said. Aldrath's personal attendant is still in the residential wing, she said. The soldiers took Aldrath, not his staff. If the attendant can get to the hall's interior serving passage, do it, Draven said. 15 minutes. She was already moving. He turned to the senior of Reth's 8 men. Hold the corridor. Nobody goes through those doors in either direction until I give the word. If Malric's soldiers push, hold position and do not engage first. Understood? Yes, my lord king. He went to find Reth. The east gate held. Reth had 400 men positioned at 3 entry points, enough to make forced passage back out of the palace a bloody calculation for Malric's forces, not enough to storm a defended throne hall without destroying everything inside it. Draven stood at the gate assessment point with Reth at his shoulder and looked at the palace's outer structure in the gray, pre-dawn dark, and the empire that surrounded them was beginning to stir. Lights in the lower city, the first sounds of the capital's morning machinery, 200,000 people starting their day with no idea that the architecture of their world was being renegotiated above them. The passes, Draven said. 3,000, confirmed, Reth said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering bad numbers without apology. My contact in the southern garrison says they've been stationary for 18 hours, waiting on a signal from inside. If the signal doesn't come, they wait, or whoever's commanding makes a call without it. Reth looked at him, sidelong. Dreadbane's second in the passes is a man named Holt. I served with Holt in the Eastern campaigns. He's not a strategist. He doesn't make calls without instruction. So they wait, Draven said. For now. How long for now was the question that had no clean answer. Draven looked at the sky, the quality of gray that came before actual dawn, the hour when darkness wasn't dark anymore but light hadn't committed yet, the shapeless hour. He had always found it easier to think in this hour and harder to lie to himself, and both of those things were true right now in equal measure. He thought about Malric's words in the corridor, 212 people, the settlement burning. The order he had given without hesitation because the calculation had been clear and the clarity had been real, and none of that made the order less of what it was. He had known for years that there was a cost to the way he governed. He had accepted the cost as necessary, had filed it under the category of things that were true and uncomfortable and unchangeable, and had continued. The cost was not a secret he hid from himself. It was a position he held. Malric had held it too, for 11 years. And then one day, watching a settlement burn, he had looked at Draven's face and found nothing there that he recognized as human enough to stay loyal to. That was the thing Draven couldn't fully put down, not the betrayal, the specific reason for it. The look Malric had described, Draven's own face, expressionless, watching 212 people lose everything because the calculation said they were acceptable as a cost. He didn't know what he had expected to feel in that moment. He had not expected to feel the absence of feeling, had not noticed the absence as a problem until Malric described it back to him like a diagnosis. Celine had said something 3 weeks ago that he had turned over and over without resolution, that she'd noticed his inconsistency at the petition hearing. The crack in the pattern, the thing that didn't fit the reputation. He had not known, until she named it, that the crack was there. He thought about that crack now, standing at the east gate with blood drying on his jaw and an empire in crisis around him. And instead of trying to close it, he let it stay open. Just for a moment. Let it be what it was. Evidence of something in him that the fear and dominance architecture of 15 years had not managed to fully bury. Reth's radio signaler caught his attention. "Message from the corridor watch, my lord. The throne hall doors opened. Partial. Someone came out." Draven was already moving before the sentence finished. Lord Severin Aldrath was standing in the residential corridor with the expression of a man who had been told something that reorganized his understanding of his situation and was still in the process of recalibrating. He was 60, heavy-set, with the deliberate quality of movement and speech that came from decades of making decisions in an environment where careless decisions cost. He had two of Reth's soldiers beside him. Celine was 3 steps back, reading Aldrath's face with the specific attention she gave to information she needed. Aldrath looked at Draven. "Dreadbane told us you had taken leave of reason," Aldrath said. "That the security order was necessary to protect the court and the succession while a regent structure was established." "I know what he told you," Draven said. "He showed us a document with your seal." "The seal was used without my authorization." Aldrath studied him. The older man's eyes moved to the short sword Draven was still holding, to the blood on his jaw, to the soldiers behind him. He was reading the room the way experienced men read rooms, not looking for what was presented, looking for what the presentation cost. "The woman," Aldrath said, without looking at Celine, "says that there are 3,000 soldiers in the Ashmark passes, under Dreadbane's command." "Yes. She says you intend to countermand the security order and call Dreadbane's actions what they are in front of the assembled court." "I intend to do more than that," Draven said. "I intend to end it tonight, with the court present, not after, because the succession question and the legitimacy question need to be resolved in front of the people who hold the Empire's functioning, not in a locked room." He met Aldrath's eyes steadily. "And because I need you to be in the room when it happens. What you're describing puts me in the line of whatever Dreadbane does when he runs out of options," Aldrath said. "Yes," Draven said. "No decoration, no softening. I know what I'm asking." A long pause. Aldrath looked at him with the particular kind of assessment that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the more fundamental question of whether the man in front of him was worth the risk. "What's changed?" Aldrath said. Not accusatory, genuine. Draven held his gaze. "I have," he said, "not finished changing, but started." It was the most honest thing he had said to a member of his court in 15 years. Aldrath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go back in, and I'll do what needs doing." They hit the throne hall with the blunt directness of a countermove that had no room left for subtlety. Draven at the center, 8 of Reth's men at flanking positions, Aldrath walking beside him with the composed deliberateness of a man who had made his decision and was not revisiting it. The doors came open under Reth's men, and they went through. The throne hall was lit with torchlight and choked with the specific atmosphere of a room full of people who have been held against their preference. Nobles, senior advisors, court officials, all of them bearing the particular expression of men and women calculating their options in real time. Malric's soldiers numbered 20 in the hall itself, positioned at intervals, weapons visible but not drawn, the implicit threat of a managed room. Malric stood near the dais. He looked at Draven, and the calculation moved across his face fast. The room, the numbers, the change in what was possible. And he moved before Draven could close the distance. Not toward Draven, toward the side corridor where the hall's secondary access led to the battlement stairs. He snapped an order to his nearest men, and 6 of them moved with him, the rest holding position, and the hall split into its 2 competing authorities with the nobles caught between them. "Let him go," Draven said. Reth's lieutenant looked at him. "He's going up," Draven said. "Let him choose the ground." Because Malric going up was Malric choosing the battlements over the hall, and the battlements meant no more document, no more managed consensus, no more legal instrument to wrap the coup in. The battlements meant combat, and combat was the one argument Draven had not lost in 15 years. He looked at Aldrath. "Hold the hall. Whatever happens outside those doors, hold the hall and hold the court. Aldrath put his hand out, an old gesture, an empire gesture, the extended hand of one lord to another, acknowledging equal weight. Draven took it, 1 second, then he followed Malric up. The battlements of Velmora Palace were the oldest part of the structure, built from the original fortress that had stood on this ground 3 centuries before the Nightfang Empire existed. Black stone, 4 feet thick, the crenellations worn by weather into shapes that had lost their original intention and become something natural. From the top you could see the whole capital spread below, the lower city still lighting up in the pre-dawn, the outer walls, the dark mass of the Ashmark Range beyond the southern territories. Somewhere out there, 3,000 men standing in the cold, waiting for a signal that was now not coming from the man who had promised it. Malric was at the north end of the battlement walk, and when Draven came through the roof access door he turned, and the 6 soldiers behind him spread wide in the way of men preparing to assist rather than men preparing to fight, which told Draven they had instructions to intervene if it went wrong for Malric. He noted their positions without looking at them directly. "You could have walked away," Malric said. "I gave you terms." "You gave me surrender," Draven said, "and you gave me her head as part of the price." "She was a variable. Variables get managed. She's not a variable." "Oh." Malric looked at him with the expression of a man who has known someone for 11 years and is seeing something he genuinely did not predict. "You actually—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was almost grief, almost the shadow of loss without the softness. "You built an empire," he said. "Everything you sacrificed for it. Everything you made everyone around you sacrifice for it. And you're going to throw it away for a woman who's been in this court for 3 weeks. "I'm not throwing it away," Draven said. "I'm deciding what it was for." Malric pulled his sword. He was not a general who delegated his fighting. That had been one of the things Draven had valued about him. The willingness to stand in the same ground as the men he commanded, to earn the authority rather than simply hold it. He was experienced and he was dangerous, and he came forward with the economy of a man who had done this often enough not to waste motion on presentation. Draven took the first strike on his short sword, and the impact went up his arm to the shoulder like a bell rung too hard, because Malric outreached him and the angle cost. He let the force redirect him sideways rather than absorbing it, gained 2 feet of lateral space, reset. The battlement was 6 feet wide, 40 feet long. Nowhere to move that wasn't toward something or away from it. Malric came again, faster. A combination, high then low, the kind of sequence that worked against opponents who defended the obvious strike first. Draven caught the second one on his forearm rather than his blade, took the edge across his sleeve without the depth of a full cut, close enough to feel the heat. His elbow drove into Malric's jaw before the follow-through completed. Malric stumbled, recovered, spit blood. They looked at each other across 4 feet of black stone. "You're going to take the fall for a king who's going to spend the next 10 years making the same choices that made you turn," Malric said. He was breathing harder now, the breath visible in the cold air. "You know who you are, Draven? I know who you are. One woman in a gray dress doesn't change 15 years. "Maybe not," Draven said. His own breathing was ragged, the cold searing in his lungs, the cut on his forearm tight with the beginning of what would be real pain in about an hour when the fight heat wore off. "But she showed me where the crack was. And I'd rather build from the crack than keep plastering over it." Malric's eyes shifted half a degree. Draven felt it before he saw it. The signal, some micro-movement of the head, the instruction to the 6 soldiers at the edges of the battlement to move, and they did. 2 of them circling wide to cut off the roof access door while 4 came forward, and the math stopped being a single combat and became something else. He took the nearest soldier at the shoulder, used the momentum to carry them both 2 steps into the path of the second, put his blade between the third man's guard and his body with a precision that was pure reflex and 15 years of survival, deciding things before thought could catch up. The 4th came in from behind, and he couldn't clear him in time. The blow hit him across the shoulders like a falling beam, drove him forward, and his left knee came down on the stone with the full crack of impact, and the world swam sideways for a second. Not darkness, just the system rebooting, the body demanding acknowledgement of the hit while his mind refused to give it. He got back up. Not fast. Not clean. He got up the way a man gets up when he has decided he's getting up and his body hasn't finished agreeing yet. 3 of the 4 soldiers were down. The 4th had backed off. Malric was 10 feet away, sword raised, breathing hard, watching Draven rise with an expression that was no longer composed. It was something cracked open, something that was old and complicated and had been building for 11 years and had finally run out of container. From below, from the direction of the hall, came a sound, voices, the specific texture of a large group of people reacting to something in unison. Not screaming, something more structured. The sound of a room making a decision. Both of them heard it. Draven straightened to his full height. His back screamed. His knee was a problem he was going to acknowledge later. He held his blade in front of him and looked at Malric across the black stone of Velmora's oldest wall and thought, with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of anything except the truth. This is what it costs, all of it. The building and the cracking and the starting over. This is the price of having built something on the wrong foundation. You have to stand in the ruins and hold the line while the new thing figures out what it is. He was not afraid. He had not been afraid of anything in years, and the absence of fear had always felt like strength. But standing here now, he understood it differently. He had not been afraid because he had not had anything he was unwilling to lose. The absence of fear had been the absence of investment. And now he was invested, genuinely and without management, in something that could be taken from him, and he was still not afraid. He was clear. "Last chance," Draven said. Malric looked at him. Below, the sound from the throne hall was still rising, and from the hall's upper window, visible from the battlement's edge, a torch moved in a deliberate arc. Aldrath's signal, the one they had agreed on. The sign that meant the court had heard what it needed to hear and was no longer Malric's managed audience. The color drained from Malric's face. He looked at the window. He looked back at Draven. And behind him, from the direction of the roof access door, came Celine's voice, sharp and carrying and pitched to reach the battlement's full length, calling out a name that wasn't Draven's and wasn't Malric's, but belonged to one of the soldiers still standing, a name connected to an alliance she had pulled from somewhere in the 3 weeks she'd spent watching this court breathe. The soldier turned at his name. Malric's head turned, and Draven moved. He covered the 10 feet in 4 strides and hit Malric at full speed with everything left in his body, driving the sword wide, getting inside the reach, his forearm across Malric's chest and his weight behind it, and they went together into the stone crenellation at the battlement's edge, with an impact that cracked the old stone and cracked something in Draven's side, and sent Malric's sword spinning off the edge into the dark below. Malric was against the stone, pinned, and Draven's blade was at his throat, both of them breathing. Both of them bleeding, the winter dark above and the lit city below, and the empire they had built and broken, and were both standing inside the wreckage of. "It's over," Draven said. Malric's face was a map of 11 years ending. Celine reached him then, coming across the battlement with fast, steady steps, and she stopped 2 feet away with her eyes going over him in the quick, specific way of someone assessing damage and not asking permission to care. And Draven looked at her over Malric's pinned shoulder, and something went out of him that had been held tight for 15 years. Not weakness, not surrender. Just the part of him that had believed holding everything alone was the same thing as holding everything. "The throne hall," he said. "Aldrath has it," she said. He read Malric's coordination documents to the full court, Fallhauern's sealed letters. A pause. Vale turned. "He's standing with the throne." The sound from below confirmed it. Not chaos, the specific sound of a room settling, the difference between a crowd and an assembly, between disorder and decision. Draven looked down at Malric. Malric looked back at him. "You won," Malric said, "and nothing I said was wrong." "I know," Draven said. He stepped back. He turned to Reth's soldiers who had come up behind Celine. "Take him." They moved forward. And from the Ashmark direction, carried on the pre-dawn wind from 50 miles south, came a sound that stopped every person on the battlement. Not close, not immediate, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever stood near an army in motion. Horns, not one. A sequence. The call and response of a force that had received no signal from its commander and had decided in the absence of instruction to move anyway. 3,000 soldiers, no longer waiting. Draven stood on the battlements of Velmora with blood on his hands and his general in chains, and his empire cracking in new places faster than he could seal the old ones. And he understood, with the complete unguarded understanding of a man who has burned through everything he was hiding behind, that the war was not over. It had just changed shape. He turned to Celine. She was already looking south. Her face was still, and in the torchlight her expression held the thing he had first seen at the Winter Ascension ceremony. That direct quality, that willingness to look at a hard thing without flinching. Except now it was aimed at the same darkness he was looking at. "How many men does Reth actually have?" she said. 400 at the gate, he said. "Another 200 I can call within the hour. 600 against 3,000. Yes. She looked at him. The pre-dawn light was doing something to her face, picking out the exhaustion and the steadiness in equal measure. "Tell me you have a plan," she said. He looked at her for a moment. At this woman who had walked into his court 3 weeks ago in a gray dress and refused to be afraid of him, who had handed him information at personal risk, who had sat across a war room table at midnight and helped him see the shape of his own failure with a clarity that none of his counselors in 15 years had managed, who was standing on a battlement in the middle of a coup, asking him a straight question and waiting for a straight answer. "I'm working on it," he said. From the south, the horn sounded again. The horn sounded a third time and then went quiet, and the silence after them was worse. Draven stood at the battlement's edge and looked south and ran the numbers with the cold mechanical speed of a man who had done this kind of calculation in the field, in the dark, with worse odds than this. 600 against 3,000 was not a fight. It was a statement about how the end would look. Reth's men were good soldiers, loyal soldiers, but loyalty did not change the arithmetic of a formed army moving on a defended position when the defending force was outnumbered 5-1. He needed something that wasn't soldiers. He looked at Celine. She was watching him with that particular quality of attention she brought to everything. Full, unmanaged, not performing patience but actually in possession of it. Her hair was loose in the wind off the peaks. She had blood on her sleeve from somewhere in the corridor, not hers, and she hadn't mentioned it, and the not mentioning of it was its own kind of statement about what she was made of. "Holt," he said. She caught it immediately. "Malric's second, the one who doesn't make calls without instruction." "He's been waiting 18 hours for a signal that isn't coming from Malric anymore," Draven said. "The horns mean he's moving, but moving and committed are different things. A man like Holt moves because standing still feels like failure. He hasn't decided yet what he's marching toward." "You think he can be turned?" "I think he can be offered a better calculation," Draven said. "Malric promised him something. Land, rank, position under the new structure. Whatever it was, it's gone now. Malric is in chains. The coup failed in the palace. Holt is leading 3,000 men toward a capital that just rejected the thing he was supposed to be reinforcing." She followed the logic to its end. "If you can reach him before he commits to the assault posture." "If I can reach him before dawn turns this into a battle that has to be finished," Draven said. "Once blood starts, it has its own momentum." "How?" "Rider," he said. "Fast. Out the east gate before Holt's forward scouts reach the outer walls, carrying a message from the king. Not a threat, not a demand, an offer of terms. He may not accept." "He may not," Draven said. "But Holt is not a man who burns for causes. He's a soldier who follows authority. The authority he was following has collapsed. I'm offering him a new one." He turned from the battlement and moved back toward the roof access, and the pain in his side from the impact with the crenellation had resolved from a bright thing to a deep grinding thing that would require attention eventually, and was not getting it now. His knee was functional. His forearm was clotted. He had been in worse condition going into the second day of the Iron Vast campaign and had come out of that one, so the body was an acceptable tool for the work still ahead. He stopped at the roof access door and looked back at Celine. "I need you in the throne hall," he said. "Aldrath has control of it, but control is not the same as consolidated. The noble houses in there need to hear what happened from a voice that isn't mine or one of my commanders. They need to hear it from someone who came into this situation without existing allegiance to either side, who can say what she saw and have it believed." She looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to make the case for you." "I'm asking you to make the case for what happened," he said. "Which is different. What happened is that a general tried to take this empire through legal manipulation and managed force, and it failed, and the court gets to decide what the failure means. I'm not asking you to lie or perform. I'm asking you to tell them what you saw. And if what I saw doesn't make a flattering picture of you, then tell it anyway, he said. I'm done with flattering pictures. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise. She was past being surprised by him, he thought. Or at least she had stopped showing it. It was the expression of a person whose estimation of something is being revised in real time, the quiet recalibration that doesn't announce itself. All right, she said. He went down. She spussy. The throne hall was a different room than it had been an hour ago. The quality of the air had changed. Not calm, not exactly, but the specific atmosphere of a group of people who have moved from managed fear to active decision-making, who have been given information and are now doing the very human thing of organizing themselves around it. Lord Aldrath stood at the dais with Halvard beside him, and the assembled court was listening with the focused attention of people who understand that what happens in the next hour will determine what the next decade looks like. Malric's remaining soldiers in the hall had been disarmed and moved to the side under Reth's men's supervision. Fallorn had been identified, separated, and was sitting in a chair near the east wall with the expression of a man who had bet on a horse that had collapsed at the first fence and was now contemplating what came next. Casimir of the Eastern Reaches stood near him, bearing the harder expression of a man who had committed more fully and knew the accounting would be steeper. Draven walked to the dais. Every person in the room watched him come. He was bloodied, and his armor was gone, and he was walking on a knee that was arguing with him about every step, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had just come from a fight. And he made no attempt to present anything other than that. He stopped at the center of the dais and looked at the assembled court of Nightfang Empire. He was quiet for a moment, not performing weight, not building to something, just standing in the full reality of the room and letting them see him in it. "You know what happened tonight," he said. His voice was even, and it carried, and it had none of the performance of authority in it, just the plain quality of a man speaking in a room that was listening. "You've heard it from Lord Aldrath. You'll hear more of it from Lady Ravarin shortly. I'm not going to stand here and give you a different version." He looked across the faces. Aldrath with his composed steadiness, Halvard with his professional anxiety held tightly in check, the lesser lords and senior advisors with their calculations running behind their eyes. "General Dreadbane spent 11 years in service to this crown," Draven said. "I trusted him more than any other man in this empire. He turned not because he was corrupt or because he wanted power for its own sake. He turned because he believed, and he had evidence for the belief, that the way I governed this empire was building toward its own collapse." A pause. He was not wrong about the problem. He was wrong about the solution. The room was very still. "I have governed through fear," Draven said. "Every one of you in this room knows that. Every one of you has felt it. You've spent years managing your proximity to the throne based on the calculation of what it costs to be seen and what it costs to be invisible, and you've watched men removed from positions and territories, and in some cases from their lives when they crossed a line I drew. I drew the lines without consulting you. I enforced them without mercy. I called it strength." He stopped. "Let that sit." "It was not strength," he said. "It was efficiency. Strength is what you build that lasts when the man holding it together walks out of the room. What I built required me in the room at every moment, and the moment someone found a way to remove me from the room, the whole architecture started coming apart. That is not an empire. That is a man holding his breath and calling it breathing." Halvard's expression had gone through something. Aldrath was watching him with the careful attention of a man reassessing a large quantity of prior conclusions. "I'm not standing here to apologize," Draven said. "I'm standing here to tell you what this empire is going to be built on from tonight forward, because you deserve to know what you're choosing when you choose whether to stay." He looked across the room. "The northern territories are being mismanaged and people have died from it. That ends. The territorial petition process has been treating the legitimate concerns of landed houses as administrative inconveniences. That ends. The emergency authority structures that allowed a general to stage a legal coup using the Crown's own instruments, those structures will be reviewed and rebuilt with this court's participation." He looked at Aldrath, starting with Lord Aldrath as the head of the Review Council. Because he's the person in this room whose judgment tonight I have the most respect for. Aldrath's expression held something that was not quite surprise, almost. He inclined his head. The houses that participated in tonight's action against the crown will face consequences, Draven said. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't make the consequences light. But the form those consequences take will be decided by a process this court is part of, not by me alone in a room. He looked at Fallorn, who met his gaze and then looked away. That's all I have to say. He stepped back from the dais and let the room breathe. Celine took his place. She stood at the center of the dais without apparent discomfort, in her riding clothes and her borrowed cloak, and she looked at the assembled court with the same directness she had been looking at difficult things with since the first night he had seen her. She told them what she had seen, plainly, in sequence, without embellishment. The dispatch from Aldrin, the meeting with Orin, the inner guard rotation, the corridor and Malric's terms, the battlement, all of it. She did not make Draven heroic. She made him accurate. She described a man who had made the correct decision repeatedly under pressure without certainty of outcome, and she described it as a person who had been present for it, not as an advocate. When she finished, the room was quiet with the specific quality of a decision being made without being spoken yet. Aldrath spoke it. The Court of Nightfang recognizes the Crown's authority, he said, and calls on Lord Dreadbane's forces in the southern passes to stand down immediately under the terms of the King's direct order. The room moved, not dramatically, the way things move when they have found the direction they were always going to find, given time and the right information. The collective exhale of a group of people who have been holding something and can now, carefully, put it down. Outside, the first real light of dawn was beginning at the edge of the sky. The rider Draven sent reached Commander Holt 6 miles south of Velmora's outer walls, at the head of a column that had been moving with the deliberate pace of an army that had not yet committed to its full speed. The message was brief and direct. The coup had failed, Malric was in custody, and Holt's men could return to their garrison positions under full pardon for all soldiers below the rank of sub-commander, or they could continue their advance and spend the next several years feeding the crows outside the walls. Holt had the intelligence to understand that these were not equivalent options. The column stopped. It took 3 hours for the formal stand-down to be completed and confirmed, and Draven spent most of those 3 hours in the war room doing the work that crises left behind. The administrative reconstruction, the communication dispatches to territorial wardens, the security restructuring, the first round of decisions about the participating houses that were firm enough to be made immediately and careful enough not to exceed what he had promised the court. Halvard worked beside him in a silence that was different from their usual working silence, more honest somehow, like a room that has been cleaned out and hasn't yet been refurnished. At one point, Halvard set down a report and said, without looking up from the next one, I should have brought the indicators to you sooner. Yes, Draven said. I was calculating. I know. A pause. So was I, for 15 years. It's a hard habit to stop. Halvard looked up then. Something in his expression had the quality of a man who has been carrying weight and has just been told he can set it down. What changes, he said, concretely, tomorrow. Draven thought about it. You come to me with what you actually know, he said. Not what you've decided I want to hear, and I listen to it without making you pay for the delivery. He met the older man's eyes. That's where we start. Halvard nodded. He picked up the next report. They finished the immediate work by mid-morning. The palace had the peculiar atmosphere of a place that had been through something. Not festive, not devastated, but scraped clean, like stone after heavy rain. People moved through the corridors with the subdued purposefulness of individuals who have had a very long night and are only now beginning to understand what it meant. Draven found Celine in the east corridor at the window above the lower city, standing in the same place he had stood alone 2 weeks ago when he'd looked at 300,000 people living under the shadow of his dominance and filed the moral weight of it under the category of things that were true and unchangeable. She heard him coming and didn't turn until he was beside her. They stood at the window together and looked at the capital coming alive in the morning light. The market districts, the packed streets, the ordinary machinery of a city that had been asleep through its own near destruction and was now going about its business in the entirely human way of people who don't know how close things came. It held, she said. For now, he said. For now is how things hold, she said. Permanently is a story you tell about for nows that didn't break. He looked at her profile. The morning light was doing what it had done in the war room candlelight, finding the intelligence and the steadiness and the thing underneath both of them that he had no clean name for but had stopped trying to manage out of himself. You told the court the truth, he said, not the version that served me best. Those ended up being the same thing, she said. They didn't have to. She turned and looked at him directly. No, she said. They didn't. I told them what I saw because it was what happened. The fact that it served you is a consequence of what you actually did, not of how I framed it. A pause. Don't thank me for the truth. Just keep earning it. He held her gaze for a moment. There was a version of this conversation, the version that his old self would have had, the one built entirely on calculation and dominance, and the management of every relationship as an instrument, where he would have received that as a condition, parsed it for its strategic implications, filed it under obligations. He could feel the shape of that version, the familiar architecture of it, and he could feel himself not going into it. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. Malric was right that I felt nothing, watching the settlement burn, he said. The words came out flat and specific, the way true things come out when you stop decorating them. I have done things from this throne that I would not undo tactically, but that I understand now cost more than the empire received in return. I can account for them. I cannot change them. He looked at her steadily. I am not asking you to make peace with what I was. I'm telling you what I was so that you're standing next to what I actually am, not a version I've edited for palatability. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people occupying the same space without filling it falsely. I know what you were, she said. I've known since before I came back to court. My family had 6 years to develop a thorough understanding of what Draven Vexmore was capable of. She paused. I came back anyway. Not because I'd forgiven it, because I'd decided that the man I saw the possibility of was worth the risk of the man I knew the history of. She looked out the window. I was betting on the crack. Something broke open in him, quietly, without drama. Not the part of him that had been holding the empire together. The part that had been holding himself apart from everything in it. The years of isolation that had worn the shape of authority. The refusal of investment that had worn the shape of strength. That part, the old necessary armor of a man who had built everything alone and believed that alone was the only safe way to build, came apart in the morning light like ice at the edge of a fire. He did not reach for her immediately. He stood with it first, stood with the full weight of what it meant to want something that could be taken from him, to have something worth losing, to be, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, genuinely afraid, not of death or defeat, but of the ordinary human terror of a person who has found the thing that matters and is aware, with every part of themselves, of how much it would cost to lose it. He had governed an empire for 15 years. He had never, until this moment, understood what it meant to have something to protect. He took her hand. She looked down at it, then up at him. The Northern Territories petition, she said. I'll need access to the actual administrative records, not just the correspondence channels. You'll have it, he said, and I want a seat at the review council Aldrath is heading. Done. And I want you to stop making decisions about my safety without consulting me first, she said, including and especially the ones you think you're making for my benefit. That one, he said, will take some practice. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same country. I know, she said. I'm accounting for it. They stood at the window while the morning assembled itself below them, the capital settling into its rhythms, the empire going on in the way empires go on, not because any single thing has been perfectly resolved, but because enough has been salvaged that the living can continue. The first spring ceremony of the year following the Malric Rebellion, as the court historians came to call it, was held on a morning that had the particular quality of northern spring, cold still in the shadows, warm where the light hit, the kind of day that reminded you that seasons changed not all at once, but in negotiation with the prior one, degree by degree. Velmora had been rebuilt in the parts that needed rebuilding. The throne hall bore no visible marks from the occupation, which had been a deliberate choice, not to erase the history, but to refuse to give it permanent architecture. The history was in the records, in the council's official account, available to anyone who wanted to understand what had happened and why. Draven had insisted on that, against the advice of two senior advisors who had argued that some things were better not documented. He had overruled them without much discussion. The ceremony was not the Winter Ascension's managed performance of submission. It was a different thing, smaller in some ways, larger in others, the specific size of something that has stopped pretending and is just what it is. The court assembled in the square before the palace's main entrance rather than inside the throne hall, because Draven had decided, 3 months earlier, that an empire that governed in the open air at least one day a year was a different kind of empire from one that did all its business behind stone. The noble houses were there, all of them, including the reduced remnants of the houses that had participated in the rebellion, their new representatives standing in the positions that Consequence and the Council's process had left available to them. Aldrath stood at the head of the Review Council's assembled members, which now included Selene as its Northern Territory specialist and 3 other voices that had not existed in any official capacity 12 months ago because Draven had not allowed them to. Halvard stood at his proper ceremonial position and looked less gray than he had looked in years. Commander Reth stood with the outer battalions. Lord Malric Dreadbane was in Velmora's secure facility, awaiting the Council's final determination on his case. Draven had not made that determination alone. He had brought it to the Review Council and accepted the process, which had been harder than he had expected, and which had produced a resolution he considered fair, not merciful, not brutal, but proportionate in a way that several of the council members had pushed him hard to achieve, and that he had, after argument and resistance and the specific discomfort of a man learning to be overruled, accepted. He had not enjoyed being overruled. He did not think he was going to enjoy it any time in the future, but he understood now the difference between the discomfort of being wrong and the discomfort of being challenged. And he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific difficulty of a man retraining instincts that had been built over 15 years, to let the former teach him something instead of reflexively treating it the same as the latter. He stood on the steps of Velmora Palace in the spring light and looked at the assembled empire, the court, the capital's gathered citizens, the faces of people who had lived under the shadow of Nightfang's dominance and were now, cautiously, beginning to look up to see what shape the light was taking. He thought about what it had cost to get here, the full accounting of it, not the version that made the cost seem worthwhile in a clean way, but the actual accounting, the settlement burning, the years of isolation, the governed through fear that had built compliance instead of loyalty, the trust extended to a man for 11 years that had been used to construct the most precise trap anyone had ever built around him. He did not flinch from the accounting. He held it. This was the part nobody told you about survival. Not the enduring of the storm, not even the hard work of rebuilding after. The part nobody told you about was this, the long, quiet reckoning with yourself. After the crisis has passed and the court has settled and the empire is on its feet, when there is nothing left to be urgent about, and you finally have to sit with what you are and what you did, and whether you can live inside the person you have been without letting that person become an argument against the person you are trying to become. He had been sitting with it for months. He did not expect to finish sitting with it. That was the thing he had come to understand, that the reckoning was not a process with an end, not a debt that would be cleared. It was a relationship with your own history. You didn't resolve it. You learned to carry it without letting it carry you. Selene stood beside him on the steps. She had been beside him on most of the steps that had mattered in the 8 months since the rebellion, and the being beside him had not looked the same as anything he had previously understood that phrase to mean. It did not mean decorative proximity. It did not mean managed alliance. It meant what it looked like. A person standing next to another person, both of them looking at the same things, both of them bringing what they had to what was in front of them, neither of them pretending to be less or more than they were. She had told him he was wrong about the Eastern administrative restructuring in February, and she had been right. She had told him he was wrong about Fallhorn's replacement in March, and he had pushed back, and taken 2 weeks to admit she had been right again. She had, in a conversation he still thought about, told him that the specific way he walked into rooms had not changed and was still making people afraid before he opened his mouth, and he had looked at that for a week before deciding it was true and that he had to decide what to do with it. He was working on it. She was patient about the working on it in the way of someone who is patient not because they expect perfection, but because they have decided the work is genuine and genuine work is worth patience. The ceremony began. Aldrath spoke the formal affirmation of the empire's structure, the new compact, the changed language of it, the governing through loyalty that had replaced governing through fear as the stated principle. Not a distant aspiration, a documented commitment with consequences attached. The houses affirmed, the battalions affirmed. The assembled citizens of the lower city, brought into the ceremony for the first time in Nightfang's history, affirmed with the specific sound of a crowd that has not been told to make noise and is making it anyway. Draven listened to it and did not perform anything. He stood in the morning light with the Empire's voice around him and let it be what it was. Not vindication, not triumph, but something quieter and more durable than either. Evidence. That things could be different from what they were. That a man could stand in the ruin of what he had built wrong and build it differently. And that the building differently was not betrayal of the original. It was its completion. The acknowledgement that the original was always meant to be more than it was, and had simply needed someone willing to say so. He looked at Celine. She was watching the crowd with the expression she brought to things that mattered. Full attention, no performance. She turned and found him looking at her and held his gaze for a moment with the directness that had not changed since the first night in the throne hall, when she had stood in a room full of people managing their proximity to power and had looked at him simply, as though he were a person rather than a force of nature, and had found that worth doing. He took her hand. In front of the assembled court and the gathered citizens and the 400 years of empire that surrounded them, the Alpha King of Nightfang took the hand of the woman who had been the first person in 15 years to look at him without fear, and held it without pretense or performance or the calculation of what it cost. Below them, Velmora went on in its morning rhythms. The market streets filling, the lower city alive, the empire breathing in its new shape, still rough, still uncertain, still a work in progress in the way that anything worth building is always a work in progress. The rising moon, when it came that night, found the palace quiet, and the throne hall occupied with the ordinary business of governing, and two people standing at the east corridor window looking out at a city that was, cautiously, beginning to trust the thing above it. Not because it had been told to, because it had been shown something worth trusting, and that in the end was the only empire that had ever been worth building.